This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is in Brussels this week, heading a major international meeting on how to tackle the threat of the Islamic State rebels. The first meeting of its kind, the gathering drew ministers from about 60 countries, including Iraq and Turkey and several European nations. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, who is vilified by both the U.S. and various Syrian rebel factions, was not invited to the meeting, despite the fact that the war is being partly conducted over Syrian skies. Assad announced this week in an interview with a French magazine that the U.S.-led campaign against ISIS was not working. He said, quote, "There haven't been any tangible signs of progress against the Sunni rebel forces," and added, quote, "You can't end terrorism with aerial strikes." The U.S. says it is not coordinating airstrikes with the Assad regime. Meanwhile, underscoring the seriousness of the pre-existing conflict in Syria, the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights this week announced a somber statistic that 200,000 Syrians had now died since the start of the civil war, emphasizing that the number was a likely underestimate because it was a conservative determination. The death toll is a grim reminder that the conflict has no end in sight. Part of the death toll now includes Syrians killed by U.S. bombs. My guest is Reese, Erlich, a veteran freelance foreign correspondent who has traveled widely across the Middle East. He's just returned from Iraq, and he's written a number of books, including Conversations with Terrorists, Middle East Leaders on Politics, Violence, and Empire, and his latest book is called Inside Syria, the backstory of the Civil War and what the world can expect. And Reese Erlich now joins me live in studio. Welcome to Uprising.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, how important, first, is this meeting that John Kerry is convening in Brussels? It is a meeting of countries that have already joined in this fight against ISIS and countries who might be considering. And Secretary Kerry is hoping to convince them, I'm guessing. What exactly do you make of this meeting?
Well, I think it's one in a series of meetings that have taken place on this topic. I don't think it's going to be particularly significant. The U.S. has a coalition that's very shaky. Assad has his coalition backing him. I think it's more rhetoric coming out of Washington.
And now, Kerry said that the U.S. campaign would continue for, quote, as long as it takes. What does that mean? I mean, for as long as what takes? For as long as we kill every last ISIS fighter? And, I mean, that reminds me of that the global war on terror in general and the war in Afghanistan. Kill every last al-Qaeda fighter, kill every last Taliban?
Yeah, it's a war without end. There's nobody on the ground in Syria right now who supports the U.S. position. The Free Syrian Army, which was promoted for many years, the Pentagon cut off their aid because they won't toe the line on the latest change in U.S. policy to focus on ISIS or ISIL. So the U.S. is in a real bind. It's started now a new bombing campaign, a new war in both Syria and Iraq, and there's no way out.
And this is interesting because initially there were calls from Syrian rebels for the U.S. to get involved.
Well, absolutely, and there still are. There are people who, for example, want to see a no-fly zone in part of northern Syria. Or I think there's a lot of misconceptions in Syria and Iraq that the U.S. will come in, bomb or invade, and then leave and allow people to determine their own future. Well, that's rather naive, to say the least.
Now, John Kerry said after the meeting that there was a, quote, consensus that the momentum of ISIS has, from several months ago, has halted. Bashar al-Assad says the campaign is not having any effect. They've flown over 1,000 airstrikes. What sense do you have that the airstrikes are having any impact beyond killing civilians, possibly?
Well, they certainly are killing civilians, and we don't hear about it because that's not part of what the U.S. is supposed to be doing, so therefore we don't hear about it. But in reality, I think the bombing has had some impact, particularly in Kobani, a city the Islamic State was likely to have overrun, very fierce resistance from Kurdish fighters, probably not only just the bombing, but the supplies and the ammunition and the arms that have been sent have had some impact. And also the opening up of the Turkish border for some fighters, Kurdish fighters, to cross. So that was something that's had an impact. But overall, the war remains a stalemate. Assad controls about 1/3 of the country. The various rebel groups control about 2/3 of the country. And the U.S. bombing has made no impact on the war overall.